The Ethics Center welcomes you to this evening's presentation. As many of you know, we like seeing familiar faces. The Ethics Center offers services to the university, chiefly, though not exclusively, dealing with areas of bioethics, medical ethics. A monthly conference is held in the Medical Center the second Wednesday of each month, A-Level Amphitheater, where we foster discussion of medical and biomedical issues. This evening's presentation is a spillover from this afternoon's presentation. We invite you to participate in those as your schedule permits. The topic this evening, as advertised, active voluntary euthanasia. Is it moral? Our two presenters are as follows. Dr. Joseph Francis Fletcher, educator, clergyman, ethicist. The two main parts of Dr. Fletcher's teaching career have been as professor of pastoral theology and Christian ethics, Episcopal Theological School, Cambridge, Massachusetts, an area of the country that some of us refer to fondly as the hub of the universe. A second assignment, visiting professor of medical ethics, University of Virginia, a post which he has held from 1970 to the present. His many books include the following titles: Church and Industry, 1930, Christianity and Property, 1947, Morals and Medicine, published in 1954, early pioneering in terms of medical ethics, a volume which rightly earned Dr. Fletcher the accolade Father of Medical Ethics. Mission to Main Street, 61, and Situation Ethics, 1966. Dr. Fletcher has previously been a guest on this campus, and those of us tied in with the Seventh-day Adventist Forum in Boston, Massachusetts, Cambridge, have had opportunity to have him as our guest previously. Our second presenter, Matthew Ellis Conolly, lecturer, author, physician, writer, scholar. Dr. Conolly currently holds the post of Professor of Medicine and Pharmacology, School of Medicine, University of California at Los Angeles. Over a score of contributions to books and chapters in books mark his publishing endeavors. In addition, in a recent interest in the field of euthanasia, essays published in the lay press include Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night, The Case Against Euthanasia, and Forming Up Against the Euthanasia Bandwagon. Moderating the discussion tonight, my colleague Dr. James Walters, Assistant Professor of Religion and Ethics, Loma Linda University. We welcome you, and we look forward to tonight's discussion. Dr. Fletcher.
Ladies and gentlemen, I remarked earlier today to another group that, thank you, that tomorrow I will have my 82nd birthday, and by the Chinese method of calculating human ages, that means I'm entering my 83rd year. And as a consequence, I feel that I have too little time left to me to waste any of it on the non-controversial. That is to say, I would like maybe greedily to be at the growing edge of things where we still have not reached anything like a consensus, but where problems are morally and socially significant, and about which, therefore, debate and cogitation and quarreling and discussion are essential in order to crystallize some kind of working consensus. And our problem tonight is precisely, I think, of that sort. It's both a troubling one and highly troublesome one, too. That is, say, troubling and troublesome to patients, to the general population, not just the patient population, to families, to physicians, nurses and courts and legislators, churches, and so on. So that I feel not in the least apologetic for bringing this issue before you quite explicitly with Dr. Conolly's help as a negative examiner of the problem. An editorial in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society recently caught my attention. I suppose that at 83 I'm somewhat geriatric myself. The editor of that journal, Dr. Stollerman, was calling upon physicians to try to be, as he put it, stewards of the dying of their patients when the battle for life has been fought and either lost or conceded. Well, more than that, the editor asked physicians to make their decisions loving decisions. That is to say, not just accurate or correct, and not even just sympathetic or empathetic, but much more positively loving decisions in their management as physicians of patients in terminal illness. Well, in Roget's Thesaurus, we find a lot of synonyms for loving, the term loving, such as goodwill and benevolence and charity and mercy and caring, humanness, and so on. But it seems to me that for tonight's discussion, the one I want to stress in Roget's list is this one: to smooth the bed of death. That is to say, as a part of a physician's loving care and treatment of his patients. So think about that for a moment. What it means to smooth the bed of death lovingly. Well, when doctors and nurses truly love their patients, I put it to you, they therefore respect their rights. Not just because rights may happen to be legally reinforced, but because rights, that is to say, morally valid claims, are surely an essential part of loving concern. And one of these rights is the right to die, the right to choose to die. Now, our discussion this evening lies around that question. What is the right to die? Is it, for example, only the right to be allowed to die by stopping treatment or through some such maneuver? Or is it the right, more positively, to be helped to die when one has freely chosen to die? Or again, does loving concern quit, cease to run, when a patient wants to end his or her life, but is too helpless to carry it out? Is it what Senator Moynihan of New York once called in an unforgettable phrase, only benign neglect, as in passive euthanasia, so-called? Or is genuine love more than that, more than benign neglect, allowing people to die only? Well, what I want to contend is that the right to die, if we look at it lovingly and not just legalistically or ideologically or selfishly, entails helping as well as allowing. If, for example, to take up an actual case, a patient makes it clear that he or she does not want to go on living. One, for example, who may have fallen into an irreversible coma, an incurably non-sapient state, vegetative state, if you like. Then he does, I would want to contend, his family and his physicians and his nurses, when he does, should end his life for him. Not simply by passively looking on and providing comfort care, but, or just, as we say, stopping treatment, but rather than that, by some active means, such as withdrawing nutrition and hydration, artificially provided in most cases, but it need not be artificially provided in such a case. In other words, starvation and inanition. Or by some quicker means, like a lethal injection. There is, I would want to contend, nothing loving about dragging out dying for hours and even days more. Newspapers and magazines and court and congressional records and medical and philosophical journals are filled more and more as the days go by with this problem. Polls of public opinion show an significantly increasing approval of not only euthanasia itself, passive euthanasia, but of active euthanasia, that is, helping to die, not only allowing to die. So that we're all troubled in conscience by it, because we all have that problem, especially with the enormous advances of resuscitative medicine. The situation has long been that in hospitals all over the country, every day, families are confronted with the terrible, heartbreaking, headache-making question: at what point could we say we have passed from prolonging living to prolonging dying without doing anything more to help than that. The distinction between letting a patient die and helping or causing a patient to die is, I would like to say, entirely empty, rationally vacuous when it's morally examined. Whether the physician simply stops treatment or, as the newspapers seem to like to put it, pulls the plug, or, on the other hand, actually ends the patient's life by direct means, in either case, the purpose is precisely the same: to bring the patient's life to an end. The living will, with most of us in our society become more or less acquainted nowadays because of the fact that 39 of the 50 states have already passed living will or the right to die legislation. The living will is passive euthanasia. In effect, I am dying, so anyway, so stop treating me and let me die. That's what it comes down to. Active euthanasia is seen in a recent guideline from the Judicial Council of the American Medical Association, which allows physicians, it's a guideline and not a law, of course, which allows physicians not only to stop treatment, but to stop food and liquids to make sure the patient dies, even though natural death, that is to say, death from so-called natural causes, might be expected not to ensue for another 20 years. Or, to use the language of the Judicial Council's report on this question, whether death is imminent or not. Clearly moving beyond passive euthanasia, conceived to be letting a patient die without further medical intervention. Now, the purpose is the same in either passive escape from unendurable life or an active release from it, from a life that is no longer wanted by the patient. Incidentally, it's very important to make this point, neither passive nor active euthanasia is morally justifiable, I would contend, if the patient does not want to die. So it is very necessary, in speaking of active euthanasia, always to speak in terms of the limits of our debate on this question, voluntary active euthanasia. Euthanasia is only acceptable morally, ethically, if it is voluntary. If it is desired by the essential decision maker in the medical situation, which is the patient, as the courts have made abundantly clear. If it is desired, physicians who resist or drag their feet are guilty of what is often condemned by the pejorative term medical paternalism. That is to say, they ignore the patient's autonomy, the patient's moral and legal right to refuse treatment. Now, the sad truth is that physicians commonly obstruct the right to die. I say this knowledgeably from within the medical community. The feelings of physicians, the visceral perceptions and insights and attitudes, sentiments that come, have not among the medical professions, not just the medical profession, but all the health professions, I would say, have not kept up with their skills, their capabilities, their advanced competences. It's no longer true that death is the enemy. Now the enemy is often a subhuman existence brought about by resuscitative medicine, such that death is to be preferred instead of life. And for those of you who are interested, here is a list of cases in which the courts, mostly appellate or Supreme Courts, not primary trial courts, have found it necessary to rule explicitly against physicians and hospitals which or who have tried to keep patients alive against their will. Barber, Bartling, Bovee here in California, Spring, Dinnerstein, and Brophy in Massachusetts, Foodie in Connecticut, Severn in Delaware, Martha Toone in the District of Columbia, Perlmutter, Landry, and Corbett in Florida, LHR, a suitably anonymized case record, in Georgia, Torreys in Minnesota, Quinlan, Conroy, and Job soon in the Jobs thing in New Jersey, Smith in New Mexico, Eichner, Storer, and Sanders in New York, where even a passive euthanasia or right to die act has not yet been adopted by the legislature, incidentally. Leach in Ohio, Collier and Hamlin in the state of Washington. Now, in one of these cases, in your own state, Bovee case, one of the justices at the appellate level in the 3rd Division added to the decision they wrote that physicians and or others besides physicians, for example, a friend or some member of the family or a nurse or whoever, should help to make such deaths as painless and quick as possible. And this justice, when that recommendation was made as a dictum, not a part of the original finding, added that, of course, that recommendation does knowingly violate a section of the state penal code which forbids anybody to aid and abet in suicide. Now, the quite recent case of Hector Hodis in Colorado is entirely parallel. Now, that is exactly, I want to put it to you, that is exactly the word for it: suicide. Suicide is choosing to die rather than to go on living. And all over the civilized world, suicide has at last quite effectively been decriminalized. But it's taken a half-century, roughly, to get it done because of the reluctance of the conventional wisdom to adjust to new technical and scientific realities. And it may take another half century or something like that to decriminalize helping suicide. And the tension between taboo on the one hand and rational decision-making on the other hand is a constant problem, inevitably and understandably, for thoughtful and loving human beings. But as you can see, I am myself personally convinced that in that tension, it is reason which will win out in terms of public policy and conventional wisdom. The fundamental conflict at work in all of these questions about death and dying is between those who are concerned about the quality of life and those who believe in the sanctity of life, or even in the case of religiously motivated members of that squad, the sacrosanctity of human life. And the bluntest way to put this, I think, is to say that we all have to decide whether mere biological function is worth enduring constant and inescapable suffering. Vegetative and non-sapient states of life, personality regression and degradation that goes with the diminution of vital signs and the loss of normal function. But in question form, we might put it, the problem that's got us so rightly, properly worried is, what good is achieved by forcing such patients to go on breathing against their will? Well, I'll stop there. It seems to me that our problem here tonight is ethically searching, emotionally uncomfortable, and I would think particularly so for professionals whose basic commitment is to healthy life and its defense and protection, which is, of course, the essence of the meaning, I think, of the commitment of people in the health professions and the helping professions in general. And yet the fact remains that it is medicine itself, especially in its resuscitative capabilities, which has posed the question for us in our time and will increasingly in the future, the question of where and when and why to stop prolonging life. And what is more, whether to help people with their dying as well as helping them with their living. Now, I'm told that Dr. Conolly, bless his heart, has another view, and I hope I've stopped soon enough to allow you time to expound it. Thank you, sir.
Well, I must congratulate you, sir, on looking so well at 83. I shall be exceedingly pleased if at 83 I look and think as well as you do now. Having just been treated to such a philosophical tour de force, I really apologize for immediately reducing this discussion to the level of bumper stickers. But outside the ivory towers, this is, of course, the way in which we lesser mortals have to communicate. And these ubiquitous devices have accustomed us to the idea of rather simply encapsulated solutions to all of life's problems. You know, the kind of thing, keep your town clean, eat a pigeon for lunch, or one that you'll understand is particularly dear to me, support a lawyer, go to med school. In confronting the awfulness that terminal illness can represent, I'm afraid that euthanasia is beginning to be trotted out a little bit as a bumper sticker solution to this problem. However, it's my belief that far from being any kind of solution worth having, it's a Pandora's box of woes that's worse than no solution at all. Now, let me make it quite clear, because of the thrust of the points which Professor Fletcher so eloquently made. I am not arguing for staving off the inevitable death at the cost of extra pain. Rather, where I see us needing to go is so to raise the level of the care that we offer the terminally ill that euthanasia no longer becomes an issue. And I hope you'll bear with me as I talk, and I will try to expand on that point of view. I'd like to begin by giving what I think are 11 of the more obvious reasons why we shouldn't even contemplate active voluntary euthanasia. First, I submit that if we have such legislation on the books, it's going to open doors that we will never be able to close again. We've seen, I think, in the context of abortion, once the principle of the inviolability of the fetus was compromised, that exception after exception was demanded, and step by step the indications were expanded until we've reached a situation now where between 1 and 2 million viable fetuses are destroyed each year in this country alone. Now, I'm not here, obviously, to discuss abortion tonight, but since we are dealing with an issue of the life and death of mankind, I think it's fair to draw a parallel. And if euthanasia is available for one, then it has to be available for all. And in the light of what happened with abortion, I have no confidence in any so-called safeguards that might be built in. I think if euthanasia is once legalized, it's not going to be long before someone will argue that, and indeed I think this evening we heard hints of this, that many comatose or paralyzed patients, quotes, would, if they were lucid enough, certainly want it, so why shouldn't a close relative or somebody in whom durable power of attorney has been vested sign for them? But you know, people change their minds. The thought of perhaps a still aware but speechless person, say someone who'd had a stroke, which need not have been all that massive, but the thought of such a person having to endure the execution of some power of attorney which no longer represented what he felt is almost too terrible to contemplate. And I do not share the disdain of the slippery slope argument against euthanasia. But whether it be a slope or whether it be a precipice we're being asked to walk over, I'm a devout believer in gravity. And there's only one place we'll end up, and that's right at the bottom. And I think we need to remind ourselves that the obscenities of the Third Reich did not begin with the gas chambers of Dachau and Auschwitz. Somebody else has said of that episode of human history that the infinitely small lever from which this entire trend received its impetus was the attitude to the non-rehabilitatable sick. My second reason for opposing euthanasia has to do with the appalling price of medical care in this country and the very inadequate means that some people have of meeting these costs. Now, this more or less guarantees that if the option of legalized suicide existed, many are going to be obliged to take that route. Not to put too fine a point on it, I think it's clear that the people most vulnerable to this artificial necessity are going to include the old, the unwanted, the poor, and numerous ethnic groups, people on the lower economic rungs of our social ladder. And I am afraid that health planning, the way it's going at the moment, based on rational principles in economy and not on human compassion and any kind of respect for human life, are pushing us inexorably in that direction. Thirdly, as a kind of derivative of that second argument, I think we should remember that there are many very special people who throughout their lives and even in their terminal weeks and months are thinking of other people before they think of themselves. Now, for these sort of people, once euthanasia has been unleashed, a terrible burden is going to be placed on those people. They're going to get the feeling that maybe to save their relatives, emotional trauma, expense, trouble, and so forth, maybe they ought to do away with themselves. I mean, quite regardless of what they would want for their own lives, this feeling of obligation will inevitably come about. Now, I think the dying patients have got enough to contend with without having that placed on their shoulders as well. And I wonder how we dare to think of unleashing this in the name of compassion and morality. Fourthly, there's a matter of trust, which at present undergirds the doctor-patient relationship. And I think this will necessarily be eroded if the possibility exists that in any way, shape, or form, the doctor has the power to administer some kind of legalized coup de grace. To give you an example of how important trust is, even in a society which hasn't yet legalized euthanasia, let me tell you a true story. Last year, I met with a man who, for a long time now, has been a leader in the field of hospice medicine in Britain, and he is a vigorous opponent of euthanasia. He'd often done battle in various public fora with a senior official of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society over there. So you can imagine his surprise when he was approached by that same individual who subsequently had had the misfortune to develop incurable cancer. Surely, my friend said, there must be some mistake. You know how I feel about euthanasia, and I know your views. Oh no, said the euthanasia man, there's been no mistake. Those things that I said were what I said when I was well. Now that I'm ill, I've changed my mind, and I want a doctor that I can trust. The fifth argument is the fact that patients are very rarely isolated individuals. Like all of us, they're part of a web of human relationships. And if the patient's family situation is anything like mine, within that web there are all sorts of quarrels that need settling, sins that need forgiving, reconciliations that need to be made. And experience has shown that the last weeks or months of a patient's life can be a time of enormous healing, crucial to the peace of mind of the patient who is dying, and absolutely essential for the relatives who shortly are going to have to cope with the bereavement process. To cut this short by euthanasia, it is generally held in the field of people who work in terminal care, would do great harm. Sixthly, those who counsel the relatives of the more conventional suicide victims all attest to the feelings of guilt which haunt the surviving relatives. And it's hard to see how this would be any less the case with euthanasia. That feeling that if only they'd been more loving, if only they'd been more supportive, if only, but of course, by then, it's too late. Seventh on my list is the observation that history is littered with diseases that once we had held to be incurable. To adopt euthanasia is going to take much of the urgency out of the research community. Would we, do you think, have made so much progress so quickly in learning about AIDS if this disease, once having been recognized as incurable, had been managed by a program of compassionate slaughter? Suicide, of course, forever closes the door on hope of any new breakthrough. and closes the door too, incidentally, on the hope of those spontaneous remissions which, albeit rarely, do sometimes occur and are well documented. My eighth argument against euthanasia springs from my recollection of what the legalization of abortion did to many of my contemporaries who had set their hearts on a career in obstetrics, but who had moral objections to abortion. Regardless of the lip service paid to the conscience clauses that were built into those laws, for them, the field of obstetrics was effectively and forever closed. If euthanasia comes to be legalized, then it inevitably is going to require medical participation, and then I fear large areas of medicine are going to be closed to people who feel on the grounds of conscience that they cannot take part in these activities. Fields like oncology, neonatology, geriatrics, and possibly a lot of general internal medicine. Number 9. Contrary to what I've been led to believe as a medical student, MD stands only for Doctor of Medicine, not for Mind of the Deity. I prefer not to talk about it too much, but doctors do sometimes make mistakes. And not a few patients at autopsy have been found to have died from some entirely treatable condition. What a tragedy if we actually performed euthanasia for some mistaken diagnosis. Number 10, for the theist, and in this country this basically means the believing Jew or the believing Christian, there's another problem. For them, life is a gift from God, to be held in trust until taken back by the giver. To choose death as an end in itself is to throw the gift back in the face of the giver. And if, as the Bible teaches, death is the last enemy, then to choose death for its own sake turns our last conscious act into one of desertion to the enemy, an explicit profession of distrust in the Lord of life. And finally, number 11, the call for euthanasia is based on the notion that the terminally ill are bound to suffer horribly and that this suffering can only be relieved by death. Like all the lies and half-truths of Dr. Goebbels, this is in danger of being believed if only because it is trumpeted so loud and so often by the well-meaning souls of hemlock and their kindred spirits. But it is nonetheless a false premise. At least it is false in the sense that it does not have to be so. There is much that we can do. Now, time is not going to allow me tonight to go into all the details of what constitutes good terminal care, and yet no answer to the challenge of euthanasia can be effective unless I can somehow persuade you that there is a humane alternative which addresses the needs of mankind in this last stage, and this I will try to do. I think it's one of the supreme ironies of our time that while terminal care has been a major concern of physicians down the centuries, the triumphant advance of medical knowledge in this generation has served to focus attention in directions that have largely excluded the dying, who in any case in our youth and success-oriented culture rather embarrass us by their failure to succeed. And such care as we do offer has in the popular mind come to mean a hospice, one of those gloomy buildings behind high walls where hushed attendants stand impotent and silent until the grim reaper finally releases their charge from further pain and suffering. The genius of the contribution of Cicely Saunders, who founded the modern hospice movement, has actually been to reclaim scientific medicine for the care of man, to show that academic excellence, critical research, and teaching all belong to the care of the whole person in his final days, every bit as much as they do in any other part of the fight against disease. And we now have medical care for the terminally ill based on a bedrock of solid scientific information. In meeting the challenge of care for the terminally ill, where cure is no longer possible, we've learned, I think, that we must never say or even think that nothing more can be done. Cure or no cure, we owe it to our patients to ensure that everything possible continues to be done. And for the terminally ill, that everything possible amounts to a very great deal. A patient dying of cancer may present with a whole constellation of symptoms, And our goal has to be to gain good control of all his symptoms so that patient and family can use to the fullest extent possible whatever time remains to them. Pain, of course, looms large in the thoughts of most people and even larger in the arguments of those who would have us adopt euthanasia. In fact, it's not the commonest symptom in patients dying of cancer. Fully a third of those people never have any pain at all. 92% of them actually complain of weakness, 75% complain of loss of appetite, 69% complain of pain, and then smaller percentages complain of a variety of other symptoms. But I think although pain is not the commonest symptom, it's a good illustrative example of what we can offer to make life worth living once again. The approach to an incurable patient with pain is no different than the approach to any other person in distress. One needs to take a careful history and to conduct a thorough examination. We come to realize through the observations of Dr. Saunders and others like her that pain is not just a disagreeable physical sensation. Cicely Saunders talks about total pain, and she describes 4 components: physical pain, to be sure, mental pain, social pain, and spiritual pain. And failure to remember this complexity is one of the main reasons why people do not always get the degree of relief to which they are entitled. Mental pain must arise, especially in the minds of those who die young. A man I was involved with recently was deeply and understandably distressed at the thought of the 2 young children he was having to leave behind. And there is, to be sure, little that we can do about the fact of the patient's impending death. But the fact that we stand by them means more than we often realize. At St. Christopher's Hospice, they make a promise to their patients that they will never be left alone, and they honor that promise. Last summer, it fell to me to preside over the last 2 months of life of a man dying of esophageal carcinoma. He was an articulate Irishman who grieved over his rapidly waning vitality, and I was made painfully aware of my inability to influence the course of events in any favorable way. "Jerry," I said, "I wish I could do more for you." And his reply surprised me. He said, without a moment's hesitation, he says, "You've done a great deal. You've listened to me." How often, I wonder, do we all let slip the opportunity to render so simple and yet so important a service to those who need just that? Social pain can arise as a patient contemplates the world as it will be when he is no longer there. If he's the provider for his family, has he done enough? Will his family have to live in reduced circumstances? Here, I think we have to help our patients put their affairs in order. If there are social services, get them mobilized, and so forth. Spiritual pain speaks for itself. I think ours is not an age that's going to be remembered for the depth of its spiritual insights. Most people nowadays do not consider the eternal order of things until it becomes clear that their immediate future is bound up in it. And I do not suggest that terminal care is a field for aggressively proselytizing people. I think our attitude has to be one of complete tolerance to the religious and to the irreligious alike. Nonetheless, there is great comfort in life's darkest hours in the psalmist's affirmation, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." And if we can share this with our patients, well and good. And if not, we need at least to be positioned to direct them to a priest, pastor, or rabbi of their own choosing. Concerning the control of physical pain, there's a lot that we can offer. For now, suffice it to say that we have to begin by determining why they've got the pain. Maybe 1 patient in 5 only has 1 cause for pain. 4 out of 5 actually have 4 causes. And 1 in 3 may have even more than that. And we have to ask all sorts of technical questions. Is the pain arising from invasion of soft tissue? Is it due to compression of nerves? Is it due to involvement of the liver? Is it due to involvement of bone? And are there threatened or actual pathological fractures? Is the pain due to some actual coincidental but non-malignant process, abscess formation, pain in a surgical scar, and so forth? And all of this kind of thinking tells us immediately that there are lots of different things that we are going to want to do for patients with pain. There's no one strategy, there's no one drug. there's a skill to be learned in managing these patients, but when it is done well, it is so effective. Surveys of places like St. Christopher's Hospice, where patients are admitted because they have particularly severe distress because of pain, show that of those selected patients, fully 95% of them can, given time, get virtually total control of their pain. And that leaves a residue of 5%, and even they are going to get some relief. And the main reason why they don't get total relief is because they came too late. And it takes quite a bit of time to adjust the doses and other forms of treatment to get on top of the pain, and for some of those poor folks, there just never was time enough to do it. So we can do a lot, and there is no excuse for those patients of whom we hear that they died in terrible and unrelieved pain. There is such ignorance about how drugs like morphine should be used, such ridiculous myths which prohibit people from giving it properly and giving it inadequate doses. But the knowledge is there, and all we have to do is apply what's already in the textbooks. I want to conclude by quoting from Dr. Cicely Saunders. She writes, "When I took the former chairman of the Euthanasia Society around St. Joseph's Hospice, he came away saying, 'I did not know that you could do it. If all patients died like this, we could disband the society.' And he added, 'I'd like to come and die in your home.'" Dr. Saunders continues, "I do not believe in taking a deliberate step to end a patient's life, and nor am I ever asked to do so. If you relieve a patient's pain, and if you make him feel like a wanted person, which he is, then you are not going to be asked about euthanasia. I think that euthanasia is an admission of defeat and a totally negative approach. One should be working to see that it is not needed." And that, ladies and gentlemen, I think is one of the big ethical challenges of the next decade. And frankly, I say, if we fail it, God forgive us, for history will find it very hard so to do.
Doctors Conolly and Fletcher. We are just about halfway through our time here this evening, and as you know from watching television, there are commercials. This will be a time for our camera people to switch the film. It'll take a few seconds.
Mr. Chairman, one of the questions I would dearly love to hear Dr. Conolly explore is whether I am right in my feeling, my perceptions, that although most of your time was devoted to what you regard as truly pragmatic objections to active euthanasia, fundamentally, you are opposed to euthanasia for the same reason you're opposed to abortion. That is to say that you believe suicide, which I don't want to run away from as an important element in the euthanasia case, that just as you hold that suicide is wrong and abortion are wrong, both because they are against the divine and the natural law. And that fundamentally, the issue between us may not be which ones of your pragmatic arguments are sound enough and which ones of mine are sound enough, but whether we aren't both coming, as the phrase has come to be nowadays, coming from a totally different worldview to start with. For me, the primary good and primary value is human well-being, which includes certainly not only negatively expressed avoidance of suffering, physical suffering, but also, of course, very importantly, avoidance of all the other kinds of suffering that are often a part of the picture for people in extremis. Whereas I think you are primarily moved by your church's teachings. That may not be an acceptable kind of question, but I'm being very greedy about this. I want to pick his brains and his mind and hear how he would respond to that. That is the question I would put to you, which to me is of the greatest interest, and I would contend might well be the most significant difference between us. However, under the heading of the pragmatic objections that you pointed to, objections to voluntary active euthanasia, you did highlight slippery slope objections, and though you minimized the importance and significance of slippery slope objections to any kind of innovation like euthanasia in our mores, I would say that slippery slope argumentation is really not argumentation, and it's not reasoning, and it's often quite irrational. It's just an expression of a sentiment and an attitude, which may be a genuine one, and one not without some kind of authentic history to justify it. But in moral theology, in your own church, for example, for centuries now, it's been an important guideline principle of theologians that the abuse of a thing does not bar its proper use. Abuse is non tollit usum. And so I would want to contend that crying wolf when new problems seem, at least to us, to call for new positions and so on, is just simply not good enough. I also would want to say about your reference to the Nazis and euthanasia, that the Nazis were not interested in euthanasia in the sense in which we're talking about it tonight. They cared nothing about, for example, our strong principle that euthanasia should be a voluntary act. They were not interested in voluntary act. They imposed the ending of lives on masses of people, and it's of course a horrible, horrible, and terrible tale, but has no relevance whatsoever to what we're talking about tonight, as of course most of the historians of the Holocaust themselves are very careful to point out to us. Also, again, another pragmatic objection. There are several very interesting ones, but I picked out one here I note. You expressed a belief, not just a fear, but a belief, that if voluntary active euthanasia were ever practiced, apparently however infrequently, and thank goodness I think the clinical situations in which it might be appropriate are relatively infrequent, relatively rare, you expressed the feeling that this would result in the end of research, medical research in the field of medical treatment. And I honestly don't see why you think that. I would say that's a psychological feeling or sense that you have, but time after time after time, medicine has learned to develop capabilities for dealing with problems, but never satisfactorily enough. And the work for research and basic research has gone to obviate the problem, if possible, altogether. It would be tremendous if we could obviate the question, is this patient in such a state that the more humane and loving thing to do would be to end his life or to let him go. It would be great if we didn't have to deal with that. And let's hope that more and more and more science will be able to narrow down, medical science will narrow down the range of situations in which such a terrible decision as this one certainly is, has to be made. But to suggest that scientists will stop trying to obviate these problems suggests, to me, suggests just the opposite. just the opposite. I think that if we find so many cases, however many they are, where still this is an appropriate question, medical science will be determined to do its level best to reduce the number even more. I would think so. Well, I think that's enough to keep us going, yes.
Fine. Dr. Conolly, would you care to respond to any of these observations?
Well, I will do my best. I guess I should first respond to your objection that I'm only saying the things I'm saying because I have a certain theological stance.
Right.
As best I understand my own heart and mind, that is not the case. Now, I don't deny that a certain set of religious beliefs is important to me. And incidentally, despite my Irish name, I'm actually not a Catholic. Like yourself, I'm Episcopalian by upbringing. But I think that that aside, if one can set such a momentous and fundamental thing aside, I would be persuaded by at least some of those other reasons that I advanced. And I agree, as you pointed out, but very politely, that some of them were weaker than others. But I would certainly be persuaded by some of those reasons that euthanasia was not a path that I wanted to go down. Now, I take your point that perhaps in some respects the way in which the Nazis certainly ultimately applied their philosophy was rather different from what we're proposing at the moment. But I think that we mustn't overestimate our own sort of moral purity, and I think our capacity for following the same kind of path is there, and we need checks and balances in everything that we do. And I think it was Santayana who's credited with the saying that those who refuse to learn the lessons of history condemn themselves to repeating it. So I like to have my feet on level ground. As to the frequency with which this would come to be applied, I'm not sure that it is that infrequent. I think I find it very sad to look at Holland at the moment because during the Nazi ravages of Western Europe, the Dutch, in fact, were heroic in the extreme in the way in which they resisted the Nazi attempts to make them collaborate in various attacks on human life, even to the point of laying down their own lives rather than doing it. And I now find it very sad that that same nation should in fact be the vanguard of the euthanasia fleet in Western Europe. And the number of patients who have been put down, whatever word one uses, by euthanasia in the last few years in Holland already runs into the thousands. We're not talking about the odd dozen cases. So it is a product for which there's a ready market, and I'm afraid that we may be surprised, as we were surprised, I think, at the number of abortions that have been done. I mean, who would ever have thought that the number would be this large? I don't think it was ever in the minds of the Supreme Court justices who handed down the decision of Roe v. Wade. And I know it was not in the minds of people who enacted legislation permitting abortion in England in 1967. That was very much argued for cases of pregnancy arising out of incest and rape, both of them actually exceedingly rare causes for pregnancy. They are, in fact, now used to modulate the effect of promiscuity in the social scene at large. You used two phrases as though they meant the same thing. You talked about helping a patient to end his life, and you talked about letting the patient go. And I do not think that they are the same thing, because this gets us into the discussion of a term you used earlier on, passive euthanasia, a term which to me is an oxymoron, if ever I heard one. It's like a thunderous silence. I think there's a contradiction of terms there. I think there's a great deal of difference, morally, medically, and in every way. If we think that you know, altering our treatment strategy, maybe laying down a therapeutic, life-saving, life-prolonging strategy in order that we can make room for that kind of treatment which involves attending to the patient's symptomatic comfort, is to be regarded as deliberately ending the patient's life. I do not think they're the same, because I do not believe that the intended end of attending to a patient's symptomatic discomfort can be equated with a deliberate step to end the patient's life in order to relieve his discomfort. Now, in the end, the patient dies, he will die, we'll all die. I mean, sooner or later that's going to happen to us all. I think that if we say it's inappropriate to give this patient chemotherapy anymore because it is not responding to the drugs we got and the side effects are unacceptable, instead the thrust of our treatment should be to give him morphine to relieve his pain or whatever. I do not see this as being the same thing as deliberately taking a syringe, loading it with who knows what, and injecting it in order to kill him. I think the intended ends are quite different, and therefore it seems to me morally they're different.
When we do something with a given object in mind, we may use different methods of contriving success, but they may be direct methods or they may be indirect methods, but they're both aimed at the same end is being sought in both courses of action. And I would say, therefore, there's no, ethically speaking, no difference between them.
This is where I disagree with you.
Yes,
I don't
yes.
think the same end is being sought.
Ah.
You see, if I relieve your pain, you may die. Actually, you won't die sooner because I give you morphine to relieve your pain. You'll actually probably live a little longer, because the physiological stress of unrelieved pain is definitely, as the Surgeon General would say, harmful to your health. But you know, my object is to relieve your pain, not to kill you. Whereas there's that other bottle whose contents are intended only for one thing, and that's to kill you. And I feel that there's an essential difference there.
Well, now you're adverting, of course, to the problem of double effect in ethical analysis, and I understand what the rule of double effect is, and it certainly has its bearing here. But all I'm saying is that a physician dealing with a patient in terminal illness who is suffering from irreversible illness, and let us say is in a non-sapient condition and permanently so, vegetative, and he wants to help this patient end it all because he's got reason to believe that's what the patient wants. As the courts are always very clear in these cases, if there's no evidence that the patient wants it, you can't impose it on them. And I would certainly agree, we're talking about voluntary active euthanasia. But in such a hypothetical case, whether you decide to bring the end of that patient's life about by indirect means or by direct means really makes no difference. You're going after the same thing, you're trying to achieve the same result. You want the patient dead. Why do you want the patient dead? Well, in the case of active euthanasia, voluntary active euthanasia, you want the patient dead because the patient thinks that is preferable to go on living under these conditions. And I find it, you know, I quoted this morning in another gathering, I quoted Immanuel Kant's very shrewd and somewhat witty observation that, witty for Kant in any case, that if you will the end, you will the means. Whatever means are appropriate to the end that you have determined is justified, therefore eo ipso become justified too. But there are those in ethical discourse who insist there is an ethics of means as well as an ethics of ends. And I take direct difference to that.
Well, if it were my objective to terminate the patient's existence, I think that I would agree with you, but I do maintain that the end I seek is different. There may come a time when I can no longer stave off the patient's disease, and by standing back, death occurs. It would occur anyway, even if I stayed in there with the chemotherapy. I'm not seeking that end. That end has come, the patient has lived his life, and it is time for him to depart. All I am seeking to do is to make that terminal phase comfortable and, if possible, useful to him. Now, in the case of the patient who is comatose, of course, I have no means of knowing what he thinks, if he thinks.
Oh, you might have, as in the Brophy case, you might have reason.
Well, as I understand the Brophy case, and I've not read very deeply into it, there was a lot of controversy about whether, in fact, he was conscious and unable to communicate, or whether he was unconscious.
Oh, no, I think there was agreement in the minds of the jurists and in the minds of Mr. Brophy's family that the record, his constantly repeated statements before this ever happened to him, that if ever did, no way he wanted to end it. He didn't want to go on living under these non-sapient, subhuman conditions. He made that very clear, that the courts up to this point would never reverse a lower trial court on these cases if they had, unless they were quite convinced that there was a real reason why we can think that the patient wants it to happen. They're very clear about that. They're very rigorous in their demanding that termination of life must be voluntary.
I think, Dr. Conolly, maybe you can make a final statement, and then we will open it up to the audience.
Well, I'm not used to having the last word in such distinguished company. I think all I would say in defense of my own profession is that you pointed out quite rightly that our wisdom in action has been left way behind by the advance in our skills. We are not alone in this, of course. The politicians and the nuclear weapons are faced with exactly the same dilemma. It's quite clear that where we have human agencies involved, MDs or not, there are going to be mistakes which are made, there are going to be errors of judgment, and I think no matter how carefully we balance our judgments, no matter how hard we listen to our conscience, there are going to be times when we do what perhaps with hindsight we'll realize was the wrong thing. I really am much grieved by the thought that the medical profession is exerting a kind of paternalism. You know, I'm a doctor and I've got a stethoscope and I will decide what's best for you with the aid of my guessing tubes. I think that we really don't intend this, if I can speak for the medical profession. I think increasingly over the last 2-3 decades, I believe the medical profession has realized the rightness of involving patients in their own therapeutic decision, not just in the terminal phase. If a man's got hypertension, I like him to get his own blood pressure machine. Or if he's a diabetic, I like him to measure his own blood sugar and monitor his therapy. I think we find ourselves caught in a vice that's often of society's making. For a long time now, the lawyers have regarded the medical profession as a kind of milk cow that can be gone to time and time again for endless dollars. And it's not surprising, I think, if the medical profession is at times a little gun-shy. And if people feel that physicians are refusing to give up in the face of all reason, but flogging on to the bitter end, to some extent, I sincerely feel society has only itself to blame. And I hope that that any arrogance and stupidity in myself and my professional peers will be explained to us and we will be helped to deal with it. But I think that when it happens, please have pity on us. We're not the ones who are solely responsible for it.
Thank you, Drs. Conolly and Fletcher. I am impressed by the civility of the debate from gentlemen of the Anglican tradition.
Civility is the word.
And I think that some of the rest of us from other traditions might learn from what has gone on here this evening. Let us open it to questions, comments from you on the floor. And maybe we could get Richard, would you be willing to take that microphone? And I believe Charles has volunteered to take this one. And if you would just let these gentlemen see that you would like to make a comment. And if you would identify yourself and your station in life for the benefit of our speakers particularly, and make your comment or give your question. I believe the gentlemen in the rear do have these microphones on. Who would like to raise the first issue? Yes.
Floyd Peterson, statistician. I haven't been here for the whole discussion, so I hope I'm not repeating something that happened. But Dr. Fletcher, the question I would like to ask is, since we have heard it mentioned a number of times that we're human and prone to make mistakes, do you feel that it's better that we have erred on the side of conservatism in not allowing haphazard, the haphazard situation where people could just die whenever they please without any control on it at all, or would you rather see us err on the other side of liberalism and let people do what they want?
I think it's fair to respond, if I heard you correctly, this way, that in my judgment, it's much better for us to err. We will err as human finite creatures. We'll err. We'll make bad mistakes, wrong diagnoses, wrong prognoses. It can't be helped. But doing the best we know how to do, I say it is better that we should, when we err, that we err on the side of loving concern than that we should err on the side of adherence to a moral principle or rule.
But I think one of the implications of the question, Professor Fletcher, may be that in light of the fact that we err, isn't it better that we err in favor of prolongation of life rather than premature termination of life?
Well, that's a very loaded question. You already said premature. I would say, certainly, I'm against all premature decision-making. And I'm sure that any responsible physician is certainly opposed in principle, and I would say generally in practice, to premature decision-making of any kind. That's not, you're not really worried about that, are you? Or is this man really worried about that? I don't think so. I don't think so.
I use that in light of the notion of erring. If we are going to err, what are the implications of that in terms of what sort of policies guide us as medical professionals dealing in these life and death situations?
I think almost all slippery slope objections, they're not arguments, objections, to doing this, that, or the other by way of innovation, whether it's a technical innovation or a moral innovation, political or whatever it is let's be satisfied with the way we are doing it. And if we try to change, we're going to make a mistake. Well, we're already making mistakes. We're making mistakes already. We'll always go on making mistakes. So that I would say that since we are going to err, it's better on the whole to make our errors in an open field of responsible decision-making rather than following a rule.